All right, so we are going to continue our talk about the integumentary system. So we've already previously spoken about the functions of the integumentary system as well as the epidermis in detail. Now we're going to move to the dermis. So on our image over here on the right-hand side, just a reminder, we have the epidermis, is the most superficial layer of the integumentary system, or of the skin, rather. And then the dermis is the deeper layer of the skin. We did talk about how the hypodermis is not technically part of the skin, but we will discuss the hypodermis or the subcutaneous membrane as part of the skin as well. All right, so the dermis, again, is deep to the epidermis. It is composed of strong connective tissue. So let's see, deep to epidermis is composed of strong connective tissue. And that's because it's going to contain many things, and so it's connective, and that it's going to be supportive for all of these different things that we'll talk about that's in the dermis. It's also nice and strong as a connective part or point for the epidermis to connect that to the rest of the body. So some of the things that we find in the dermis are blood vessels. And you can see some of these here, blood vessels as well as lymph vessels. And so you can see that they are in our subcutaneous layer, the hypodermis, down here, as well as moving up and into the dermis itself. So we have blood vessels and lymphatic vessels. We also have hair follicles. So the hair, of course, is leaving the skin or moves through the skin and out onto the surface, but the actual follicle of the hair is in the dermis here. So you can see that the epidermis ends at this kind of wavy portion here, and then down here, this fatty area is our hypodermis. So what we're talking about is this area in between here, the dermis, and you can see that the hair follicle here, where the hair starts, is in the dermis. We also have nerves in this area, in the dermis, and so one of the nerve endings here is this Pacinian corpuscle. So those are some nerves there, and then we also have nerves moving throughout, just along the same way we have blood and lymph vessels. We have nerves going throughout the dermis as well. And then also we have different glands in the dermis, and we'll talk about the different types of glands here. We have the sweat glands, and we have let's see, where do they have it labeled? Here we go. Sebaceous glands as well. Now we'll have 3 different types of glands that we'll talk about. All right, so the first gland that we will talk about are the sweat glands. So if we look at the sweat glands, we underline that here, you can see that it's kind of this squiggly area here, this tubular type of gland, and then the tube is going to move through the dermis, up through the epidermis, into the surface of the skin. So our sweat glands, we actually have 2 different types of sweat glands that we're going to talk about. We have the eccrine sweat glands and the apocrine sweat glands. So first let's talk about the eccrine sweat glands. So these are the sweat glands that we think about most often all over the entire body. So these cool the body by evaporating sweat. And sweat is mostly urea and water, well, mostly water and urea, and then salts. And so our body, the reason our body sweats is because it's getting hot, right? So our body gets really, really hot, and it wants to try to figure out a way to cool down the body, to get it to a more comfortable temperature, so we don't get to a point where we are degrading our proteins and breaking things apart. So our body does this by creating sweat, which is mostly water, and then we also have some waste that we get rid of. So it eliminates a small amount of wastes as well. A small amount of wastes. So we're able to get rid of wastes in the sweat, but mostly what we're talking about with sweating is trying to cool the body down so we don't get too overheated. And the way that this works is because the sweat is made, which is mostly water, and then that water is going to be secreted to the surface of the skin. And when that happens, then our body, in the increased temperature, is going to transfer that heat to the water that's on the surface of the skin, the sweat. And then when the water heats up to a certain temperature, it's taken on so much of the heat from the body that it then evaporates. And then it takes all that heat with it. And then we continue to sweat, continue to put that moisture on top of the skin. And then our body is going to keep transferring the heat to that water, to that sweat, so that it can then be evaporated. Now, those are the eccrine sweat glands, and these are all over the body. So, let's see, all over the body. Now, the second type of sweat glands that we're going to talk about, the apocrine sweat glands. These are located mainly in the skin of the axilla. So remember, axilla is the armpits, the groin region, the areola, or areolae, which are near the nipples of the breasts, and the bearded facial regions in men. Of adult males, of course. So these are where we have ducts that are opening into hair follicles. And so in our illustration, we just saw the sweat gland that's going to open up to the surface of the skin. And that's why we have the two different types. This would be an example of the eccrine here in the illustration. And the apocrine are going to open up into the hair follicles. And this is sweat that's secreted during emotional stress. So when a person is really, really stressed out, that's why a lot of people will talk about kind of stress sweat that's in the armpit region, for example, in the groin region. And then also during sexual excitement. And so these are regions that do get sweaty during regular heat as well, because they also have eccrine sweat glands, but mostly they're made up of the apocrine sweat glands, and then it's during emotional stress and sexual excitement. Now in these, again, they're opening up into the hair follicles, and then what we see happening is that then this is eaten by bacteria on the skin. And then when it's eaten by bacteria on the skin, this produces an odorous byproduct. Which, of course, is what we think of when we think of somebody smelling. So we have these eccrine sweat glands that are kind of all over the body, and we have the apocrine sweat glands that are in the armpits, the groin region, and other areas. And then when we get a little bit stressed out, or when we put our body in a stressful situation, then we start to use the apocrine sweat glands as well as the eccrine sweat glands. And then the use of these apocrine sweat glands in those regions, we have bacteria in higher amounts there. It's eaten by the bacteria and then produces body odor. And we notice then that we don't have that type of body odor like on our knee, for example. And that's because we would have more of the eccrine sweat glands there that are not opening up to the hair follicle, that are just moving onto the surface of the skin or opening up to the surface of the skin. So those are the sweat glands, the two different types of sweat glands. The next structure that we're going to look at are the sebaceous glands. So our sebaceous glands here, and you can see it's labeled here. So we have a sebaceous gland here, and you can see that it opens up to the hair follicle there. So let's talk about the sebaceous glands. So what is a sebaceous gland? A sebaceous gland is the technical name for oil glands. So these are the glands that are going to be secreting oil. And as we saw in the illustration, it is connected to hair follicles. And it opens up to the neck of the hair follicle, so the neck of the hair follicle. And we saw that it wasn't at the very, very bottom where there's the papilla or the bulb of the hair follicle, but it's on the neck portion of the hair follicle where it's starting to come out through the dermis and then through the epidermis to the surface. Our sebaceous glands, what they secrete is sebum. So sebum is the name for oil, the oil that is secreted. It's an oily substance. And what this does is it prevents dehydration of the hair as well as the skin. And it also is going to inhibit growth of certain types of bacteria. So it decreases or prevents dehydration of the hair. So it opens up to the follicle, so it's going to be the oil, the sebum, is going to be coating the hair follicle or the hair as it's moving out of the body. So the oil will be pushed into the hair, and then it's going to start squeezing out of that area onto the surface of the skin. So in that way, it's also coating the hair as well as the skin, and inhibits growth of certain bacteria. And so within this oil, it's going to inhibit the growth of bacteria, meaning the bacteria is not going to be able to utilize the substances that it needs to utilize in order to grow. So it'll stop the growth of bacteria. So overproduction of these cells and overproduction of the sebum due to different hormonal changes is what can lead to clogging and acne. So overproduction of the cells that are in the glands, so the cells that make the oil, as well as the oil itself, which of course is sebum, due to hormones / hormonal changes. And then what that can do is it can cause clogging and then lead to acne. So that's the second type of gland that we have. Remember, we're talking about the dermis here. So in the dermis, we find 3 different types of glands. We find the sweat glands, which were 2 different types. And then we have the sebaceous glands, which are the oil glands. And then the third type of gland that we find in the dermis is the ceruminous glands. And the ceruminous glands are modified sweat glands located in the ear canal. And what they do is they are open to the surface of the ear canal, or the ducts of our sebaceous glands. So they can open to the surface of the ear canal or into the ducts of the sebaceous glands. And what they make is cerumen, which we typically call earwax. So it produces cerumen. So our ceruminous glands, mostly we see them in the ear canal, opening up to the surface of the ear canal, and it's going to produce cerumen. And cerumen is a waxy substance. That's why we've kind of generally called it earwax. So it's a waxy secretion. And the reason for this is that it is a sticky barrier. So hopefully the idea here is that it's going to prevent the entry of foreign bodies into the ear canal. So prevent entry of foreign bodies into the ear canal. This is just one of the ways that we protect ourselves. We protect our body from things getting into it. So our body is going to produce this cerumen, this earwax, and get it all over in the ear canal, so that when the wind is blowing or when something's flying around, when it gets into the ear canal, hopefully it sticks to that. So for example, bacteria, hopefully it sticks to that. And then over time, the earwax is actually coming out of the ears. So it naturally starts to pull out of the ears. And in fact, we don't want to get rid of all of our earwax because, of course, it has this protective function. But our ears will naturally get rid of the wax. It naturally will come out over time. And so it catches these things, and then it will naturally be coming out and not get into the body, hopefully not to cause an infection. So that sums up the glands that we have in the dermis and some of the various things that we have in the dermis. So we talked about the different things that we find in the dermis, the blood vessels, the lymph vessels, our hair follicles, nerves, and glands, and then we took a closer look at the 3 different types of glands. So the last thing that we are going to take a look at as far as the anatomy of the skin is the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer, or the superficial fascia. So again, this is not actually part of the skin, but it is deep to the dermis. And we see that down here, the hypodermis in this area below the dermis, or deep to the dermis. And this acts as an anchor. So it's an anchor for the dermis. So something for the dermis to attach to make sure that it stays stable in the rest of the body. It is composed of areolar and adipose tissue. So areolar tissue is a type of protective tissue. Areolar tissue also withstands stress in various directions, so it's kind of a mass of different types of fibers and a mass of different types of cells, including immune system cells. And so it has a protective function because of those immune system cells, but it also has a lot of strength. Because it has tensile strength. It has the ability for it to be pulled on and tugged in lots of different directions. And that's important, of course, for something like the skin. We have our skin that's being pulled on and tugged and moved in various ways as we're walking or as we're sitting or as we lean on something. And so having something that can withstand that, that's connecting it to the rest of the body, is important. And then adipose tissue is fat. And so this acts as a layer of storage, actually. So we store fat in our subcutaneous layer or hypodermis. But then also, it's important because of cushioning. So when we bump into something, it's good to have a layer of fat there as cushion or protection. So we're not bumping into or hurting something underneath there. So the hypodermis in general, then, is useful as a storage place for fat. So storing that long-term energy, which is what we want to do. It also contains large blood vessels. And that's going to supply the skin with nutrients and then remove the waste. So we have the largest of the blood vessels that will be at the hypodermis level, and then those will branch off and get smaller. You can even kind of see here in the illustration, down here in the bottom right, we have our larger vein and artery that's indicated, and then as it's moving up into the dermis, you can see that they're branches, so they're smaller at that point. And this is important because this is actually where we see a lot of injections occur. So this is a site for injections like insulin. So if a person needs to give themselves insulin injections, this is a location that's done. So the injection goes into this hypodermis, or the subcutaneous layer, and then it can go directly into the bloodstream at that point. All right, so that sums up the 3 anatomical layers, 2 plus the hypodermis of the skin. So now I'd like to talk just a couple minutes about some different conditions like skin cancer and burns. So when we talk about skin cancer, there are actually a couple different types of skin cancer. The most common type of skin cancer is our basal cell carcinoma. So basal cell carcinoma is the most common type of any cancer, actually. And this, as its name implies, is when the basal cells become cancerous. So recall that the basal cells are that deepest layer of the epidermis. And those are the cells that are going to be multiplying, so duplicating, and then pushing those cells as they're duplicating further toward the surface or the superficial portion of the skin. And when that is happening, the basal cells are staying there. They're like the stem cells. And so the basal cells will become cancerous in basal cell carcinoma. And that can be incredibly dangerous or difficult because then those cells are not reproducing and they're not filling in the skin and making keratinocytes like they need to be. The second type of skin cancer is squamous cell carcinoma. And squamous cell carcinoma is cancer of the squamous cells, and if we remember what the squamous cells are, those are the keratinocytes. So the keratinocytes become cancerous. And then the last type of skin cancer is melanoma. And melanoma, as its name implies, is where the melanocytes become cancerous. And in this case, this is the most deadly form of cancer, of skin cancer. So remember, our melanocytes are those that are going to be producing melanin, and melanin served a protective function. Not only did it protect the melanocytes by covering over their nucleus to protect the DNA, but they also secreted that melanin into the keratinocytes, so the keratinocytes would have this barrier, this wall on the nucleus. So if our melanocytes become cancerous and they're no longer doing their job, they're no longer producing melanin, then our keratinocytes no longer are protected. And so this becomes very, very deadly because we have no way to protect any of the cells of our skin from the UV damage, and a person would have to ensure that they stay out of the sun and try to protect themselves from the damage. Also, this would be deeper in the skin than the others. So this would be even below the basal cells, still part of the epidermis, but kind of below the basal cells and mixed within. And so this can be a serious situation. So when we're talking about skin cancer, they're the A, B, C, D, and E's of skin cancer. So these are ways to identify a skin cancer. So the A stands for asymmetrical growth. So one of the ways to indicate whether or not it's skin cancer, whether or not it's just an ordinary mole or a freckle or something, is that when it's growing, it's asymmetrical. So if there's a growth and it starts to kind of grow like this, not very symmetrical, then that might be an indicator that that is skin cancer. B stands for border, is indistinct. So the reason that I drew it this way over here is because of that. The border tends to be kind of like it's shaded, rather than it being something that's a very solid border, and then this could be all filled in, for example. This is a very solid border, but in the case of skin cancer, the border is indistinct, meaning there can be kind of different levels and different amounts of shading that make up the border, darker areas and lighter areas. C stands for the color. So color is bluish, blackish, purplish. So it's very, very dark, bluish, black, purple. And again, this can be all of these different colors in this area that has skin cancer. So varying degrees of color and varying borders. D stands for the diameter. So the diameter is bigger than a pencil eraser. And this is important because a lot of freckles tend to be smaller than a pencil eraser, so it's a good indicator that that would be a freckle rather than skin cancer. Same thing with moles. Most moles can be smaller than a pencil eraser, and so something that would be larger than a pencil eraser could be an indicator of skin cancer. And then lastly, the E is that it is evolving or changing. And that just means that you've noticed perhaps that there's some sort of spot there, and then months later it looks perhaps different, and that is because it's changing. If it's changing, then it's not a freckle, it's not a mole, and then it should be looked at. So the last thing that we are going to talk about very quickly in regards to the integumentary system, or the integument, is our burns. So we're just going to briefly look at the different types of burns. So they go in order from first degree to fourth degree. So a first degree burn just to kind of define these different things, is superficial. So it's a superficial burn, meaning that it only affects the epidermis. And oftentimes it doesn't even really go too far into the epidermis. It can be very, very superficial. This would be something like what we would see with a sunburn typically. Not a really, really bad sunburn, but just a typical reddish sunburn. And this is where we're going to have it just affecting the epidermis. And that's why a sunburn can take just a couple of days to get rid of it, depending on the level, or a week or so. Because this is part of the epidermis, it can heal relatively quickly. Then we have a second-degree burn. A second-degree burn is going to affect the epidermis and a portion of the dermis. So a portion of the dermis. So this is when we're getting deeper. Obviously, if we're moving through the epidermis, what we've done then at this point is burned off the skin surface, the epidermis, and we moved into the connective tissue of the dermis. So this is getting through those kind of typical skin cells and into the connective tissue of the dermis. This can be really painful and takes a lot more time. It can take months, weeks, months to heal. Then we have third-degree burns. And a third-degree burn is going to, of course, affect the epidermis, meaning that the epidermis will be completely burned through. And it also goes through to the dermis. So in this case, in the third-degree burn, what we're talking about in this case is we are completely destroying tissue, also destroying nerve endings, and sensory function. So when we get to the third-degree burn, that's when we're really going to have an increase in pain, of course, and then also the ability for that portion of the skin, or that area of the body, to have the same sensory experience has been diminished. So things like touch and temperature and things like that are not going to be present in a third-degree burn because those nerve endings have been burned off. Versus the second-degree burn, we're just talking about a portion of the dermis and likely not getting to the actual nerve endings at that point. And, of course, the first-degree burn is just superficial epidermis. Then we have the fourth degree. Now, the fourth degree is just sometimes a subcategory of third degree. So you may not have heard of the fourth degree, and that's likely because it was lumped in with the third degree burn, but some classify it as a separate degree. And this is when we are affecting the underlying tissues. So really we're getting all the way to the muscle and the bone. So these are incredibly serious burns where someone's going to the hospital, where grafting is likely going to be needed because we're burning all the way through and reaching the muscle as well as the bone. So we've gone all the way past the skin, even the hypodermis at this point, and now we're eating away at tissue underneath. So that summarizes the integumentary system. Just a couple of things there at the end as far as skin cancer and the burns. And then, of course, we talked about the different layers of the integumentary system. And in this lecture, we talked about everything from the dermis, what it contains, and the hypodermis.